Welcome to The Deep Dive. Today, we're setting course for a really fascinating figure, someone whose ideas honestly reshaped how entire nations thought about power on the world stage.
We're talking about Alfred Thayer Mahan.
Exactly, an American naval officer, but here's the twist, right? His huge legacy isn't really built on commanding ships in battle.
Not at all. It's entirely built on his thinking, his writing,
Hmm.
his intellectual contribution, which is fascinating because, well, he himself didn't seem cut out for the standard military career path.
It's a genuine paradox. We look at the sources you shared, and it seems both Mahan and his father, Dennis Hart Mahan, a big deal professor at West Point himself, they both sort of thought Alfred was less fit for a military than for a civil profession.
Yeah, that's the quote. He just didn't quite click with the operational side, the day-to-day command aspects, it seems.
But intellectually, completely different story. He was second in his class at Annapolis back in 1859.
Really excelled in the tough subjects. Seamanship, sure, but also physics, political science, things that require deep analytical thinking.
So you can see the groundwork being laid there. His real talent wasn't executing orders, maybe, but understanding the why behind them, the theory.
That's it precisely. And his career was, well, it was a naval career, Civil War service, the usual postings. But the huge turning point, the moment everything changed, was 1885.
Okay, what happened then?
He gets this assignment. Captain Mahan is asked to lecture on naval history and tactics, but not just anywhere, at the brand new Naval War College in Newport.
Ah, the War College. So this wasn't just another shore duty posting.
Far from it. This was, you could argue, the moment his real life's work began. He moved from being, an officer doing his job to becoming a foundational thinker.
And what did he find when he started looking at naval history for these lectures?
He found, well, a mess, basically. Just a collection of stories, battle reports, dates, and names. There was no underlying philosophy, no coherent framework connecting it all.
No sense of universal principles derived from what actually worked over time.
Exactly. That was the gap he saw. He spent the next 7 years, and they were tough years, mind you. Lots of resistance, very little money from the government.
Sounds familiar.
Doesn't it just? But he basically steered that institution through its infancy, and in the process, he built this new field. He essentially turned naval history into a kind of predictive science.
Defining this concept we now just call sea power.
Right, and this wasn't just academic, it was vital. Naval technology was exploding in the late 19th century, steel ships, big guns, steam engines. American strategy needed a solid intellectual foundation to keep up.
Okay, so that sets up our mission for this deep dive. We need to really unpack the core ideas that Mahan laid out, especially in his big work, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History.
We'll dig into his famous 6 conditions for sea power, his key doctrines like concentration and interior lines.
And crucially, how these ideas were applied, or sometimes ignored, in major historical moments. We're talking Trafalgar, the Caribbean. Understand what made his theories so timeless.
All right, let's start right there with the absolute core of the influence of sea power upon history. This book wasn't just influential in the U.S., it went global. Why? What was the big idea?
The power of it, I think, is its sweeping, almost simple thesis. Sea power, Mahan claimed, is the fundamental principle that decides whether great nations rise or fall.
So not just about fighting pirates or defending coasts, it's about national destiny.
Absolutely. It elevated naval strength beyond just defense or trade protection. He argued it was the essential ingredient for global political influence, for national survival even. He actually quotes Francis Bacon.
Oh yeah, what's the quote?
Bacon said, "To be master of the sea is an abridgment or epitome of monarchy." Mahan basically took that idea and wrote the instruction manual for how to achieve it in the modern age.
So it wasn't just about, say, building more battleships than the other guy. It had to be deeper, more connected to the nation itself. Exactly. Sea power wasn't just a military add-on. It had to be rooted in the nation's geography, its economy, its people, even its government structure. Mahan identified 6 specific conditions. 3 he called natural, 3 related to government and people that determined if a nation can become a true sea power.
6 conditions. Okay, let's spend some real time on these because they seem foundational. What's the
Yeah.
first one? Geography.
Yes, number 1, geographical position. This is huge. A nation whose location naturally focuses its attention outwards towards the sea has a massive head start, especially if it doesn't have major land borders to constantly worry about.
Right. The classic example everyone uses is Great Britain versus France, isn't it?
It's the perfect illustration. Britain, an island, its security, its entire outlook was maritime. The English Channel was its frontier. France, on the other hand,
Always looking over its shoulder on the continent.
constantly. Huge land armies, wars with Austria, Spain, the German states. It was a perpetual continental distraction. Every time France tried to build up a serious navy, some land war would flare up and suck away all the resources and attention. It couldn't maintain focus.
So where did Mahan place the United States in this geographical picture, especially back then?
Well, before the Panama Canal, he saw the U.S. position stuck between two massive, unconnected oceans as a significant strategic weakness.
A weakness, because...
Because it forced the dispersion of naval forces. You had an Atlantic fleet and a Pacific fleet, but they couldn't easily support each other. If the main threat was in the Atlantic, your Pacific ships were basically irrelevant, and vice versa. This violates that core military rule. Concentrate your forces.
And you can see how that analysis would directly fuel the argument for building an Isthmian canal later on.
Absolutely. Mahan's strategic logic was a huge driver behind the push for Panama. It showed his thinking had real-world consequences.
Okay, condition number 2. Physical confirmation. This sounds like it relates to the coastline itself. Climate, maybe?
Yes, it's about the practical realities of the coast. Does it have good, defensible harbors? Is the coastline itself relatively safe for ships to operate near? What's the prevailing weather like?
Can you give an example of how this played out?
He looked again at the Anglo-French Wars. Britain had a significant advantage in the English Channel. When those strong westerly gales blew, which they often do, British fleets blockading the French coast could run for shelter in places like Plymouth or Torbay. They could ride out the storm relatively close by and then get back on station quickly.
And the French.
The French fleets, in ports like Brest, were often pinned down by the same winds. They couldn't get out until the weather changed significantly. So Britain's physical confirmation gave its fleet more time on target, more operational endurance. It's a subtle but important advantage.
Makes sense. Condition 3 moves to extent of territory, but specifically the coastline length, not total land area.
Right. It's not about how big the country is overall, but about the length and character of its coastline relative to its population.
He used an analogy for this one, didn't he? Something about a fortress.
Yes, a brilliant analogy. He said, a nation is like a fortress. The strength of the fortress depends on the size of the garrison, that's the population, compared to the length of the walls, the encante, that's the coastline.
So if you have a really long wall, a huge coastline, but only a tiny garrison, a small population...
Then that long wall is actually a weakness. It's too much to defend. It's easily breached.
And how did this apply to a major American conflict like the Civil War?
It was a textbook example, sadly for the Confederacy. The South had this enormous coastline, thousands of miles long, but its population was relatively small, largely agrarian, concentrated inland, and crucially, as Mahan put it, unused to the sea.
So the Union Navy, even though it started small, could effectively blockade that vast territory.
Yes, because the garrison was too small and improperly deployed to defend the walls. If the Confederacy had possessed a large, experienced seafaring population and a navy to match, the Union blockade would likely have been impossible. Instead, that long coastline became the South's primary vulnerability, allowing Union power to strike deep inland via rivers.
That directly leads into condition 4, then, number of population. But it's not just sheer numbers, is it? It's about what those people do.
Exactly. It's not just a head count. Mahan stressed the importance of having a significant portion of the population engaged in maritime activities, callings related to the sea.
Like fishermen, merchant sailors, shipbuilders.
Precisely, because that creates a pool of experienced personnel for the Navy in wartime. It fosters a national understanding of and connection to the sea. He was quite critical of the U.S. in the 19th century for letting its merchant marine decline and relying on foreign ships for trade.
You can't just conjure up skilled sailors when a war starts.
You really can't. You need that maritime ecosystem, the commerce, the shipbuilding, the seafaring population to truly sustain sea power. The sea itself is both the resource and the training ground.
Okay, the last two conditions shift more towards national character and government. Number 5 is character of the people. What did he mean by that?
This one's a bit more intangible. It's about a national aptitude or inclination towards commerce, towards seafaring, towards venturing out onto the oceans for trade and exploration, maybe even colonization?
A kind of adventurous commercial spirit?
Sort of. He argued that most successful maritime nations throughout history shared this characteristic. It drove them outwards. The Romans were his main exception, a people not naturally drawn to the sea who built a powerful navy purely out of military necessity, often using foreigners to crew their ships. But that was rare.
And the final condition, number 6, character of the government. This is about political will.
Yes, the intelligent willpower, as he called it. This is what provides the consistent direction and energy needed to build and maintain sea power. A government has to truly understand and champion the nation's maritime interests.
Does it matter what kind of government it is? A democracy versus, say, a monarchy?
Mahan acknowledged that a strong, centralized despotism, if focused, could perhaps build up a navy faster. But he believed that a free government, one that truly reflects the will of a maritime-minded people, is likely to build more durable sea power, even if the process is slower. The absolute key, though, is consistency,
Why consistency?
because building effective sea power takes decades. Constant policy shifts, budget cuts driven by short-term politics, flipping between focusing on the Navy and the Army, all of that undermines the long-term investment and strategic planning required. You need sustained national commitment.
And this analysis, particularly about government focus and national priorities, led Mahan to issue a pretty stark warning to the United States at the time, didn't it?
He was deeply concerned. He saw the U.S. potentially repeating the same mistake France historically made,
Which was...
being seduced by internal riches, by the redundancy of home wealth. In the U.S. case, it was the explosive growth of the interior, the Midwest, the Mississippi Valley. All the investment, the political focus, was shifting inland away from the coasts.
So the nation was turning its back on the sea.
In a way, yes. Mahan worried that this inward focus was leading to neglect of the sea frontiers. He argued that even though America had all the raw materials, the potential strength, if the national will wasn't directed towards the sea, that potential would remain unrealized, and the coast would become vulnerable. Politically weak, strategically exposed, despite all the wealth inland.
Okay, so those 6 conditions lay the groundwork, the potential for sea power. But once a nation decides to pursue it, how should that power actually be used? Mahan helped formalize the language, didn't he? Borrowing from land warfare thinkers like Jomini.
Yes, he established a clear hierarchy for thinking about military and naval action. It starts with strategy.
What was his definition of strategy?
He called it the art of making war upon the map. It's the high-level planning, the thinking that happens before the campaign even begins. It's done in the study, in the cabinet. Strategy determines where and why you're going to apply force. It sets the overall objectives.
So it's the big picture. Then what comes next?
Then you have grand tactics. This is the execution on the battlefield, or the seascape, if you will. It's how you arrange your forces, how you conduct the actual battle. It's the how of fighting.
And linking those two?
Is logistics. The often unglamorous but absolutely vital business of moving your forces, supplying them coal for the fleets back then, fuel, now maintaining communications, repairing ships. You can have the best strategy and tactics, but if your logistics fail, you're finished.
A good commander needs to understand all 3, presumably.
Absolutely. But strategy leads. It dictates the requirements for tactics and logistics.
Now, you mentioned earlier that some practical, operational Navy folks back then were a bit skeptical of all this theory, this making war on the map. They saw it as impractical.
Yes, there was definitely that sentiment. The idea that real war is learned on the deck, not in a book. But Mahan pushed back hard against that.
How did he argue for the practicality of strategy and study?
He argued that the study is the practical preparation. He loved using the example of Napoleon planning the Marengo campaign.
Right, you mentioned that earlier, Napoleon with the maps and pins.
Exactly. Weeks before the battle, Napoleon is on the floor, meticulously plotting the movements of his army and the Austrians. He essentially figures out the whole strategic sequence, where he'll march, where he'll force the Austrians to fight, how he'll achieve local superiority, and the battle unfolded almost exactly as he'd planned it on that map.
So the physical fighting was the tactical execution, but the winning decisions were made weeks before, through study.
Precisely. The study, the deep thinking, enabled the decisive action later. Mahan would ask, where did Napoleon get that ability? And Napoleon himself answered, study history. Study the campaigns of the greats Alexander, Hannibal, Caesar.
So studying the past isn't about memorizing battles. It's about absorbing the underlying principles that lead to success or failure.
That's the core of it. It builds the mental toolkit, the experience base, so that when you're faced with a complex situation under pressure, you can recognize the patterns and make sound decisions quickly. That's intensely practical.
Okay, so applying those principles leads us to 2 really crucial concepts in Mahan's work. Concepts still central to military thought today. Central position and interior lines. Let's break down central position first.
A central position is basically a geographic spot that lets you sit advantageously between potential enemies or strategic objectives.
Like France being between Spain and Austria, as you mentioned earlier.
Exactly. Or on the sea, think about Great Britain again, positioned where it could readily face threats emerging from the North Sea or the English Channel. It gives you flexibility and makes it harder for your opponents to combine against you.
And interior lines, that's linked to the central position.
Yeah. Yes. Interior lines are the operational advantage conferred by a central position. It means you have shorter distances, and therefore shorter travel times, to move your forces between different points or fronts compared to your enemy, who has to go the long way around on the exterior lines.
It's about speed and efficiency of movement.
Purely. Think of a wheel hub versus the rim. Moving from the hub out to any point on the rim or between points via the hub is always faster than traveling around the circumference. That's the advantage of interior lines. It lets you concentrate your forces faster where needed.
Can you give some concrete examples, maybe ones that were created, not just naturally occurring?
The Great Canals are perfect examples. The Panama Canal fundamentally changed the strategic map for the U.S. It created interior lines between the Atlantic and Pacific, making that long, dangerous trip around South America obsolete for naval purposes.
Turning a strategic weakness into a potential strength.
Precisely. Similarly, the Suez Canal provides interior lines between Europe and Asia compared to sailing around Africa. And a purely military example is the Kiel Canal in Germany.
Connecting the Baltic and North Seas.
Right. It allows the German fleet to shift rapidly and securely between those two vital seas without having to sail all the way around Denmark through contested waters. That's a massive strategic asset built specifically to create interior lines.
It's fascinating how infrastructure becomes strategy. Ultimately, though, whether it's position or lines, it all seems to boil down to controlling movement and supply controlling communications.
That's the absolute crux of it for Mahan.
Yeah.
The ability to protect your own sea lines of communication, your trade routes, your supply lines, your troop movements is vital. But even more critical is the ability to sever your enemy's communication.
Because that strikes at their ability to wage war at all.
Exactly. As Mahan put it, it affects the very root of a nation's vigor. If you can cut off their resources, isolate their armies or fleets, prevent them from trading, you undermine their entire war effort. Control of communications for Mahan was the ultimate expression and goal of sea power.
All right, so we have the strategic framework. Now let's get into the operational doctrine. Mahan's absolute #1 rule, it seems, was concentration. Keep your forces together, all in one place.
It sounds almost too simple, doesn't it? But history is just full of examples where nations, especially alliances, violated this principle, often with disastrous results.
Why are alliances particularly prone to this error?
Well, Mahan pointed out the proverbial weakness of alliances. It stems from their inferior power of concentration. Each member of an alliance often has its own specific goals, its own territory to protect, its own political priorities.
Leading them to split up the combined forces to cover everything.
Exactly. They try to be strong everywhere and end up being strong nowhere. Mahan was adamant. Don't straddle. Don't try to do two things at once with the same force unless you are so overwhelmingly powerful that you can afford to waste ships. Otherwise, concentrate. Pick your main objective and hit it with everything you have.
And this wasn't just abstract theory for the U.S. The Spanish-American War provided a really harsh, real-world lesson in the dangers of a divided fleet, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. The famous voyage of the battleship USS Oregon. It's seared into naval memory.
Explain what happened there.
The Oregon was on the West Coast when the war broke out. But the main potential threat, Admiral Cervera's Spanish squadron, was heading for the Caribbean. The U.S. needed its best battleship there now. So the Oregon had to undertake this incredible high-speed dash all the way around South America.
Thousands and thousands of miles.
Yes, a long, grueling, and strategically terrifying journey. Because while it was steaming, completely isolated, the U.S. battle fleet was effectively divided. The entire high command was just holding its breath, hoping the Oregon would make it before Cervera could strike, or before the Oregon itself was intercepted. It was a logistical nightmare born from strategic division.
And Mahan saw this temptation to divide the fleet, maybe between the Atlantic and Pacific, as a recurring danger for U.S. policy.
A constant danger. He argued passionately against proposals to permanently split the main battle fleet. He pointed directly to the Russo-Japanese War as the ultimate cautionary tale.
What happened to the Russian fleet there?
Russia made the fatal mistake of dividing its forces. They had a major fleet based in Port Arthur in the Pacific and another main fleet thousands of miles away in the Baltic Sea.
So Japan could deal with them one at a time.
Precisely. The Japanese Navy blockaded and eventually helped destroy the Port Arthur squadron. Then, months later, when the Baltic Fleet under Admiral Rozhetsvensky finally arrived after its own epic, exhausting voyage.
It was too late, and they were sailing into a trap.
Exactly. The Japanese Navy, concentrated in waiting, utterly annihilated them at the Battle of Tsushima. Two separated fleets, both destroyed.
Whereas a single, concentrated fleet, even if based primarily in one ocean,
could use the interior lines of the Panama Canal, once built, to move relatively quickly to meet a threat in the other ocean. That concentrated fleet acts as a deterrent everywhere, precisely because it can be concentrated. Mahan's stark conclusion holds. Concentration protects both coasts. Division exposes both.
Okay, let's shift focus slightly to the role of the fleet. Mahan made a very clear distinction between the defensive and the offensive roles in naval warfare.
Yes, and he was unambiguous about where the Navy primarily belonged. He saw the defensive as the necessary posture of the weaker side. If you're weaker, you're forced onto the defensive.
And what's the inherent problem with being on the defensive at sea?
Its main drawback is that it usually forces you to disperse your forces. You don't know where the stronger enemy will attack, so you have to try and cover multiple points, spreading your ships thin. The only real advantage of the defensive is that you have time to prepare fixed defenses, like fortifications or minefields.
So the defensive is reactive, dispersed. What about the offensive?
The offensive, Mahan argued, is the decisive element in war. It's proactive. It seeks out the enemy and forces the issue. And that, he insisted, is the Navy's true sphere.
The battle fleet is an offensive weapon.
Fundamentally, its main job is to find and destroy the enemy's main fleet, thereby winning command of the sea. Coast defense, things like shore batteries, mines, maybe small torpedo boats for harbor defense, that's the purely defensive part.
And the purpose of that coast defense
is primarily to protect the fleet's base, the dockyards, the fuel depots, the critical infrastructure, and crucially, to free the main fleet to go on the offensive. If your battleships are stuck guarding their own harbors, you've completely misunderstood their purpose. You're using an offensive weapon for a static defensive task.
This brings us to a really interesting strategic concept that was debated a lot back then, the fleet in being. What exactly is that?
The fleet in being idea is that even an inferior naval force, simply by existing and posing a threat to attack, can significantly disrupt the enemy's plans and tie down much larger enemy forces.
Like Cervera's squadron in 1898. It wasn't huge, but the threat it posed caused the U.S. a lot of anxiety.
Exactly. Cervera's fast cruisers were a perfect example. Their uncertain location and potential to raid the U.S. coast or attack troop transports forced the U.S. Navy to keep a powerful flying squadron of its own fast ships anchored at Hampton Roads, Virginia, for weeks, just waiting. It definitely delayed the invasion of Cuba.
So it worked in a way. It had a psychological and operational impact.
It certainly did in the short term.
Yeah.
It demonstrated the power of potential threat. However, Mahan ultimately felt that the strategic value of a fleet in being was much overstated.
Why did he downplay its long-term importance?
Because, he argued, relying solely on evasion and the threat of action isn't a winning strategy. Eventually, the superior force, if competently led, will find and corner the inferior one. The fleet in being, if it wants to survive, is often forced to retreat into a fortified court.
Becoming what Mahan called a fortress fleet.
Precisely. Like the Russian fleet hiding in Port Arthur. Once it's blockaded in port, it might survive, but it has completely surrendered control of the sea. It's no longer a strategic factor offensively, it's just waiting to be dealt with.
So the fleet in being can cause delays and anxiety, but it can't ultimately win control of the sea.
Not on its own, no. Mahan insisted that the ultimate goal is control, and control requires the ability to fight and win. That means force gun power, fighting capability is the dominant factor, not just speed or evasion. He had a great line summing it up. Force does not exist for mobility, but mobility for force.
In other words, speed is useful only because it helps you bring your guns to bear effectively.
Exactly. Maneuverability matters, but only in service of delivering decisive force. A fleet built primarily for speed at the expense of fighting power is fundamentally flawed in Mahan's view.
Mahan constantly used historical examples to illustrate his principles. Let's look at a couple of key case studies he analyzed. First, maybe the most famous naval battle ever, Trafalgar, 1805. How did that battle demonstrate his ideas, particularly concentration?
Trafalgar was huge for Mahan. because it represented a radical break from the dominant naval tactics of the previous century.
What were those older tactics like?
The standard practice, seen in battles like Malaga in 1704, which Mahan often cited, was for the two opposing fleets to form parallel lines and basically sail alongside each other, blasting away ship to ship.
Sounds like it could lead to long, indecisive fights.
Very often it did. Lots of damage, lots of casualties, but rarely a truly crushing victory for either side. Ships might be damaged and drop out of the line, but total annihilation was rare.
But Nelson at Trafalgar wasn't looking for an indecisive draw.
Not at all. Nelson understood, as Mahan would later emphasize, that only numbers can annihilate. His goal was the complete destruction of the enemy fleet. So he threw out the old playbook.
What was his plan?
Instead of forming a parallel line, Nelson divided his fleet into two columns and sailed them almost perpendicularly into the Franco-Spanish line, aiming to pierce it at 2 points.
So hitting the enemy line head-on, that sounds risky.
It was risky for the lead ships, definitely. But the strategic genius was that it achieved overwhelming concentration of force at the points of attack. Nelson's plan aimed to use about 16 of his ships to smash into and overwhelm just 12 ships in the enemy's rear and center.
Creating a local superiority, even if the fleets overall were closer in number.
Exactly. He aimed to crush that rear portion of the enemy line quickly, before the ships in the van, at the front, could even turn around and get back into the fight effectively. He used another part of his fleet to contain or occupy the enemy van while the destruction happened in the rear.
So tactical concentration led to annihilation.
Complete annihilation. The Allied fleet lost 21 ships captured or destroyed. The British lost none, though Nelson famously died. But the strategic impact was arguably even bigger than the tactical victory.
How so?
Trafalgar effectively ended Napoleon's realistic hopes of ever invading Great Britain. He couldn't contest control of the English Channel. It forced him to shift strategy towards economic warfare, the continental system, trying to bankrupt Britain by closing European ports to its trade.
Which ultimately failed, largely because Britain still controlled the seas.
Precisely. Trafalgar wasn't just a naval battle, it was a hinge point in world history, confirming the decisive influence of sea power on grand strategy, just as Mahan argued.
Okay, let's shift focus now to a region Mahan considered critical in the modern era, especially with the prospect of an interoceanic canal, the Caribbean. He called it the strategic key to the two great oceans.
Yes, he saw huge parallels between the Mediterranean's historical importance to Europe and the Caribbean's emerging importance to the Americas, particularly once the Panama Canal was built, linking the Atlantic and Pacific.
And within the Caribbean, he did a fascinating comparison between two key islands, Jamaica and Cuba, right, to illustrate strategic nuances.
He did. It's a classic Mahan analysis looking beyond just the map dot to the underlying realities. Geographically speaking, Jamaica actually holds the superior central position.
Why Jamaica?
If you look at the map, Jamaica sits almost perfectly equidistant from the major choke points. Colon at the Panama Canal, the Yucatan Channel between Cuba and Mexico, and the Mona Passage between Hispaniola and Puerto Rico. It's ideally placed to control movement through the basin, the natural key to the Caribbean geographically.
But there's always a but in strategy. Mahan argued Cuba ultimately held the stronger hand. He said Cuba had the grip that can wrest it away. Why?
It came down to logistics and secure interior lines. Cuba, being a much larger island and crucially closely linked to the U.S. mainland, had a massive advantage in its ability to sustain itself and project power.
How so? What were Cuba's interior lines?
Cuba had or could easily develop secure land-based communications. Ports on the south coast like Guantanamo or Santiago, relevant in the Spanish-American War, could be supplied via rail lines running internally across the island to Havana, and Havana, in turn, could be readily supplied across the short sea route from the U.S. Gulf Coast.
So its supply lines were largely internal to the island or short and easily protected?
Exactly. Now compare that to Jamaica. Jamaica is an island totally dependent on the sea for everything. Its supplies would have to come via long, vulnerable sea lanes from distant bases, perhaps like British Santa Lucia, over 1,000 miles away.
So in a conflict between powers based in Cuba and Jamaica,
the fleet based in Cuba could operate more offensively, knowing its base was relatively secure and could be resupplied reliably. The fleet based in Jamaica, however, would be constantly worried about protecting its own extremely long and exposed sea lines of communication. A significant portion of its strength would be tied up just defending its supply convoys.
that shows how land power and logistics directly impact sea power. It's not just about the ships.
It's absolutely critical. Cuba's secure logistical base gave it endurance. Mahan concluded that attacking a well-defended Cuba would impose such a long, insecure line of communication on the attacker that the effort would likely be finally untenable. The strategic key isn't just location, it's sustainable presence.
Mahan wasn't just analyzing history. His work had a direct impact on shaping American foreign policy thinking. A prime example is his take on the Monroe Doctrine.
Yes, he was very clear on this. The Monroe Doctrine, the U.S. policy stating that European powers shouldn't interfere in the Americas or acquire new territory here, was just words on paper, he argued, unless backed by credible force.
So the policy itself demanded a strong navy.
Absolutely. He insisted that the guarantee of the Monroe Doctrine required an adequate navy. The size and capability of the U.S. fleet shouldn't just be based on, say, protecting trade routes. It had to be sufficient to uphold these core national policies against potential challengers. If you declare a major policy, you better have the muscle to enforce it.
He also had some pretty strong views on the role of war itself, didn't he? Especially in an era when peace movements were gaining ground. He wasn't exactly a pacifist.
No, he was a realist. While acknowledging the horrors of war, he argued that sometimes, unfortunately, war is the only way to achieve a necessary or morally just outcome when peaceful means have failed.
What examples did he use?
He often pointed to the American Civil War as a necessary conflict to end slavery, something negotiation couldn't achieve. He also cited the recent liberation of Cuba from Spanish rule as another example where force was needed to break an oppressive system.
So he saw war sometimes as a regrettable but effective agent of change.
Yes, he believed that some conflicts involved issues of equity too complicated for decision upon mere rules of international law or arbitration. Sometimes he felt moral force alone just wasn't enough to overcome determined resistance to necessary change. The world, in his view, hadn't evolved past the need for force as a final arbiter.
That realism definitely comes through in his analysis of what he saw as a major emerging challenge in the Pacific. This involved demographic and economic pressures, didn't it?
It did, and this is certainly one of the more controversial aspects of his writing when viewed today. He observed what he termed a deep instinctive popular determination among English-speaking populations on the Pacific Rim, specifically the U.S. West Coast and Australia, to prevent large-scale immigration from Asia, particularly from China and Japan.
And how did he frame this issue?
He framed it primarily as an economic and territorial security issue. He saw it as a clash driven by the pressure of densely populated nations seeking outlets versus less populated nations trying to preserve their existing character and economic standards. His warning was stark.
What was the warning?
He essentially argued that laws and treaties alone wouldn't be enough to maintain these exclusion policies in the long run against immense demographic and economic pressure. Ultimately, he believed, physical force, meaning military and naval power, would be the only practical guarantee.
So military strength was necessary to back up immigration and land policies.
Yes. His rather blunt advice was basically either fill up your land with men of your own kind, meaning populate these areas densely enough to remove the vacuum, or be prepared to defend them by force. It's a clear example of his belief that national policy, especially on vital issues, ultimately rests on the capacity for physical defense.
Let's turn to another area where his views still resonate: the commerce warfare debate. He was a strong defender of the practice of seizing enemy merchant ships and cargo in wartime, wasn't he? Against calls for immunity for private property at sea.
He defended it vigorously. He saw the attack on enemy commerce as a fundamental aspect of sea power, not some kind of barbaric relic.
What was his rationale? Why go after civilian ships?
Because war runs on money and resources. He put it plainly. Money, credit, is the life of war. Lessen it, and vigor flags. Seizing enemy merchant ships and their cargo wasn't about random destruction. It was a direct strike against the enemy's economic strength, their ability to finance the war, and their logistical capacity.
So it's analogous to attacking an army's supply trains on land.
Exactly the analogy he used. It cuts the enemy's communications, disrupts their economy, and pressures their population. He argued that if a dominant sea power agreed to grant immunity to enemy commerce, it would be voluntarily giving up one of its most powerful weapons. It would be like abdicating the scepter of the sea.
Basically hamstringing itself. Financial warfare was a key tool.
A crucial tool. He believed interrupting trade and finance was often the quickest way to bring an enemy nation to the negotiating table.
Interestingly, he also flipped this argument around, suggesting that a nation's vulnerable commerce could actually be a force for peace. How did that work?
He used the example of Germany at the time. Germany was rapidly building a huge merchant fleet engaging in global trade, but much of that trade had to pass close to the shores of Great Britain, the dominant sea power.
Making it extremely vulnerable in case of war.
Extremely vulnerable. Mahan argued this massive, exposed economic asset acted as a kind of hostage to fortune. It gave Germany a very strong incentive not to go to war with Britain, unless absolutely vital national interests were at stake, because war would mean the immediate and devastating loss of that maritime trade.
So economic interdependence and the vulnerability that comes with it could act as a deterrent.
Yes, a powerful, practical deterrent based on national self-interest.
Finally, let's touch on the underlying philosophy that kind of holds Mahan's whole system together. His view on military obedience. It wasn't just about blindly following orders, was it?
No, it was much more sophisticated than that. For Mahan, true military obedience meant faithfully forwarding the general object of the campaign or the strategy.
Meaning the subordinate needs to understand the bigger picture.
Absolutely. Blind obedience to a specific order might actually undermine the overall goal if circumstances on the ground or at sea have changed unexpectedly. A good subordinate commander needs to understand the commander's intent, the main strategic objective.
So they can exercise initiative intelligently.
Precisely. They need the knowledge and the confidence to adapt, sometimes even to deviate from a literal order, if doing so clearly serves the larger strategic purpose. He used Nelson again as the prime example.
How so? Nelson was known for his independence.
Right, but Mahan quoted Nelson's own philosophy. To serve my king and to destroy the French, I consider as the great order of all, from which little ones spring, and if one of these little ones militate against it, I go back to obey the great order.
Meaning the ultimate goal, defeating the enemy, trumps sticking rigidly to a minor instruction if that instruction no longer makes sense in achieving the main goal.
Exactly. This requires trust, clear communication of intent from the top, and intelligent initiative from below. It's what allows a large, complex military organization to function effectively and adaptably. It's the human element that makes the strategic system work. #outro.
You know, looking back across Mahan's work, what's really striking is how he elevated naval thought. It wasn't just about ships and guns anymore. It became this grand synthesis of geography, economics, politics, and military science.
Yeah, this deep dive really highlights those core principles that just keep echoing down through history. We've seen the absolute strategic necessity of concentration, avoiding that fatal temptation to divide your forces, and the power of interior lines, whether natural or man-made, in allowing you to maximize your force by using time and geography efficiently.
And that fundamental distinction between offense and defense, making sure your main fighting force, the battle fleet, is free to do its job, seek out and destroy the enemy because its base is secured by adequate coast defenses.
He really forced strategists to think long-term, beyond the next battle, to the decades of national preparation and consistent policy needed to truly wield sea power effectively.
Which leads us perfectly into our final, maybe provocative thought for you, the listener. Traditionally, navies were often justified primarily as protectors of a nation's merchant shipping. But Mahan's analysis takes us way beyond that.
He pointed out that even a nation with relatively little overseas trade, like Russia in his time, still needed a powerful navy. Why? For purely military and international policy reasons.
To project power, to influence events far from its shores, to uphold its strategic interests and political claims.
And he argued the United States was in exactly the same boat, strategically speaking.
So here's the core implication to chew on. According to Mahan's logic, the United States requires a large, capable, and modern navy regardless of the size of its merchant marine, even if, theoretically, not a single commercial ship flew the U.S. flag.
The need for a strong navy would still exist, simply to support and enforce declared national policies and vital interests. Think about the security of the Panama Canal, the defense of distant territories or allies, upholding principles like the Monroe Doctrine, or simply maintaining influence in critical regions.
Mahan's ultimate lesson, then, is that for a major power, the justification for naval strength transcends economics. It's the fundamental physical guarantee of its political standing, its security, and its ability to shape its own destiny in a competitive world.
The real question Mahan leaves us with isn't just about the cost of maintaining such a force, but about the strategic consequences for a great power of not possessing the means to sustain its place and its policies on the global stage.